The morning light was still soft when she walked into the airport, holding her boarding pass with both hands as if it might slip away. She had flown many times before, but today felt different. Today she was traveling alone after a long time, and something inside her felt heavier than her small carry-on bag. She paused near the windows of the terminal and looked at the aircraft that would soon take her hundreds of miles away. She always admired planes, how they rose, how they moved, how they turned the impossible into routine. But she admired one thing even more: the cockpit. The place she was never allowed to sit. The place she once dreamed of belonging to. While walking toward her gate, she noticed the pilots arriving. One was a tall man with calm eyes, the other younger with a friendly smile, greeting passengers as they passed by. She stepped aside to let them through and lowered her gaze slightly out. Of habit, she respected them deeply. They held lives in their hands, but she also wished she understood what they saw behind that cockpit door. She had asked once, years ago, during a school trip, if she could see inside. The answer had been a firm no. Not allowed, not for passengers, not for someone who wasn't trained. And ever since, that single moment stayed with her like a tiny stone in her chest. The boarding call came, and she entered the aircraft with slow steps, taking in the warm, recycled air and the low hum of machines preparing for flight. Her seat was near the front. She settled in, placed her bag carefully beneath the seat, and fastened her belt. She looked around, noticing families, business travelers, and people who seemed tired even before the flight started. She wondered if anyone else felt the same mix of excitement and quiet fear. Planes always reminded her of how fragile everything could be and how strong humans choose to be in spite of that. As passengers continued settling, she overheard a soft conversation between the flight attendants. Something about the captain not feeling well earlier that morning. She didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just casual talk. Pilots dealt with stress all the time. They were trained for it. They had backup plans. There was always a system. That was what she believed. The aircraft doors closed. The cabin lights dimmed. The safety demonstration began, but her mind drifted away again toward the front of the plane. She imagined the cockpit, the endless buttons, the screens glowing like stars, the calm voices talking through headsets. She wished she could see it just once, just to feel what it was like to be behind that door, just to understand the world from that angle. But she reminded herself again, she wasn't allowed. Rules were rules. The engines began to rumble, their sound gentle at first, then deeper, vibrating through the floor and up her legs. The plane slowly rolled toward the runway. She felt her heartbeat match the rhythm of the wheels. The younger pilot's voice came over the speakers, steady and calm, telling them they would soon take off. His tone was warm, almost comforting. She leaned back in her seat, breathing in softly as the plane paused at the end of the runway. Then came the moment. The engines roared louder, the plane surged forward, and everyone pressed back into their seats as the world outside blurred into a streak of concrete and wind. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound wrap around her. Takeoff was always the moment she felt both fear and wonder rise together, two emotions she never learned to separate. But then something happened. The plane lifted slightly, then dipped. Not violently, but enough to make her eyes open again. She felt a shift, a strange hesitation in the motion. The engine still roared, but the climb didn't feel steady. The passengers around her exchanged confused looks. A few held their armrests tighter. She tried to stay calm, telling herself that planes do this sometimes. Air pockets, wind shifts, nothing serious. But the feeling in her stomach told her something else. Within moments, the flight attendants began moving faster than usual. Their eyes sharper, their steps more urgent though they tried to hide it. One of them moved quickly toward the cockpit door, knocked firmly, and waited. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. Still nothing. Something was wrong. The younger pilot suddenly came out, something that almost never happened during takeoff. His face was pale, his movements tight with panic he tried to mask. He whispered something to the nearest attendant, and although the words were not loud, the expression said everything. She felt her breath freeze. The plane was still climbing, but unevenly now, as if unsure of itself, like a bird unsure of its wings. Passengers began murmuring. Some leaned forward. Some prayed quietly. She sat still, her hands cold, her heart beating faster. She didn't know what was happening in the cockpit, but she could feel it. Something serious. Something that could not wait. Within seconds, the younger pilot rushed back inside, leaving the door half open for a brief moment. And in that moment, she saw something she was never meant to see. The captain slumped sideways, unconscious. Her body reacted before her mind did. She stood up slightly, breath caught in her chest, staring at the door. She wasn't allowed in the cockpit, but fate, it seemed, didn't care about rules today. For a long moment she couldn't move. She stood frozen in the narrow aisle, her fingers still touching the top of her seat, as if holding onto something familiar. Her eyes remained fixed on the cockpit door that had swung halfway shut again. She kept seeing the same image repeating in her mind. The captain leaning sideways, motionless, his headset slipping off one ear. It felt unreal, like a scene she wasn't supposed to witness. But she had. And now she couldn't pretend everything was normal. The passengers around her seemed unsure of what to do. Some had seen her stand. Others only knew something felt wrong. Everyone sensed the shift in the air, the sudden tension. A flight attendant hurried over to her, not harshly, but with urgency in her voice. She asked her to sit, to stay calm, to remain in her seat until they understood the situation. But even the attendant didn't sound convinced by her own instructions. The younger pilot reappeared for a second, his face tight, his breathing fast. He looked out at the passengers. In a quick sweep, his eyes landing on anyone who might look calm enough, capable enough, or simply willing to help. But he didn't find what he needed. He didn't have time to explain anything. The plane was still climbing, not smoothly, not dangerously unstable yet. But something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. She finally sat down again. But her mind refused to rest. She heard the flight attendants whispering words like, "Captain, oxygen, medical kit," not responding. None of it gave comfort. The younger pilot was now alone up front. One person flying a plane was normal. One person flying a plane while also dealing with a medical emergency was not. Her hands began to sweat. She wiped them on her clothes, trying to think clearly, trying not to let fear take over. She didn't know how to fly a plane. She didn't even know what half the buttons inside that cockpit did. But she did know something else. The pilot didn't single quotes T. She knew what it felt like to think clearly when others panicked. She had grown up helping her uncle repair old machines, sitting for hours in his workshop, learning how engines breathed, how wires connected, how systems depended on one another like living things. Not airplanes, but the logic was the same. Machines needed calm hands. She didn't know why her mind brought up those memories now, but they grounded her. They reminded her that she wasn't helpless. Maybe she couldn't fly a plane, but she understood something many people didn't, how to stay steady when the world wasn't. A small shake ran through the cabin. Nothing dramatic, but enough for a few passengers to gasp. She felt her pulse jump. The younger pilot must be fighting to keep the climb stable. He was dealing with too much at once. They were barely minutes into the flight. The captain hadn't woken up, and the pressure of takeoff was still settling. Suddenly the intercom crackled. The younger pilot's voice came through, strained but trying to sound steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical situation. I need everyone to remain seated and calm. If there is anyone on board with medical experience, please notify a flight attendant immediately." The words hung in the air like mist. People looked around. A few hands slowly went up: nurses, a retired doctor, someone studying medicine. Flight attendants rushed to gather them. But she knew something they didn't. The medical volunteers would be brought to the captain. They would try what they could, but the real problem wasn't just the captain's condition. The real problem was the timing. The younger pilot had to fly the plane and manage the emergency alone. He had to talk to air traffic control, evaluate the captain, keep the aircraft steady, handle procedures that normally needed 2 hands, 2 minds, 2 sets of eyes. He was trying to do it all, and the aircraft was feeling it. A soft alarm beeped from the cockpit, faint but unmistakable. She wasn't close, but she heard it. She wasn't meant to hear it. The passengers definitely weren't meant to hear it. But they did. A wave of murmurs moved through the cabin like a quiet tremor. She took a breath, a deep one. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew she had to move with purpose. Her instincts told her something the rules never allowed. Sometimes, help doesn't come from the place people expect. One of the flight attendants rushed by carrying medical equipment. The aisle briefly cleared, the noise softened, and she finally saw her chance. She stood again, not out of panic, not out of impulse, but out of something stronger. She stepped forward. The same attendant from before noticed her movement. This time she didn't tell her to sit. Instead, she asked, "Do you have medical experience?" She shook her head. "No, but I can help him." The pilot. He needs someone who can stay calm. Someone who understands machines and steps. It sounded strange even to her ears, but the attendant didn't dismiss her. Not immediately. She examined her face, her steady breathing, her clear tone. Panic wasn't there. Fear wasn't controlling her. Something else was purpose. Another tremor passed through the aircraft, small but noticeable. The attendant swallowed and stepped aside enough for her to move closer to the cockpit. "Don't go inside," the attendant said softly. "Just wait here. I'll tell him you're willing to help." She nodded, though she already knew she wasn't going to remain outside forever. Behind that door, the younger pilot was fighting alone, and she could no longer ignore the truth rising in her chest. Maybe she wasn't allowed in the cockpit, but maybe, just maybe, she was needed there. She waited just outside the cockpit door, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her breathing steady. From inside, she could hear the young pilot talking to air traffic control, his voice tight with effort. Every word he spoke came out faster than the last, as if he were juggling too many tasks at once. The aircraft was still climbing, but unevenly, like a tired bird trying to gain height with one wing weaker than the other. The flight attendant returned after a moment, leaning close so others wouldn't hear. "He said he'll try to manage," she whispered. "But he didn't refuse your help. He just doesn't know what you can do." She nodded. It made sense. No pilot wanted untrained passengers near the controls. But she also knew something important. This situation wasn't normal, and normal rules didn't always fit emergencies. Inside the cockpit, another alarm beeped, this one sharper, quicker. The attendant's eyes flicked toward the door nervously. Passengers were starting to notice the repeated sounds. People shifted in their seats, whispering, glancing up the aisle toward the front. Even without understanding aviation, everyone sensed something wasn't right. The young pilot finally opened the door again. His face looked different, now sweat along his forehead, strain in his jaw, focus so intense it seemed to pull his gaze inward. He didn't look at her directly at first. His eyes were scanning the cabin, checking on the attendants, the movement, the atmosphere. Then he noticed her standing calmly, hands by her sides, not shaking, not panicking. "You said you can help?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I know how machines think. I can follow steps. If you tell me what to do, I won't get in your way." For a moment he hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because the situation left him almost no space to think. He had to choose quickly, struggle alone, or risk trusting a stranger who didn't look afraid. He made his decision. Just stay outside the door for now, he said. Keep your eyes here. I might need you to relay things, or hold something, or check something on the captain. She nodded again, accepting the boundary but understanding the meaning behind it. He wasn't refusing anymore. He was preparing for when he might need her. As he disappeared back inside, she leaned slightly forward. The door stayed open a few inches this time, not enough to see everything, but enough to hear the quiet storm happening inside. Altitude hold, not responding, switching manual trim. Requesting priority return. His voice carried urgency. Not fear, but the kind of pressure that could break someone if they weren't ready for it. Meanwhile, the medical volunteers had reached the captain. She watched as they moved, carefully checking his breathing, checking his pulse, adjusting his seatbelt so he wouldn't fall further. One of them whispered, "He's unconscious but stable. Maybe exhaustion, maybe sudden fainting." They couldn't say for sure, but stable wasn't enough, not up here. Not now. The aircraft gave another small dip. Not sharp, not dangerous yet, but noticeable. A few passengers gasped again. A child cried softly. Someone pressed the call button repeatedly. The cabin had become a quiet mirror of rising panic. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to focus. She listened to the engine hum beneath the floor. She listened to the faint clicks of switches inside the cockpit. She listened to the young pilot's breath, uneven but determined. And beneath all that, she felt something strange but steady growing inside her. This wasn't about her wanting to see the cockpit anymore. This was about being exactly where she was meant to be. The attendant returned. "He wants you," she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and fear. "He said he needs an extra pair of steady hands." She stepped forward without hesitation. Inside the cockpit, the world looked different. Screens glowed in soft blues and greens. Buttons blinked like quiet stars. The young pilot sat tense but focused, one hand gripping the control column, the other managing switches. The captain sat slumped to the side, breathing but unresponsive. For a moment, she forgot her fear. She forgot the rules. She forgot that she had never been allowed here. All she saw was someone who needed help. "I'm here," she said softly. He didn't look away from the instruments. "Good, stand behind me. Don't touch anything unless I tell you. But listen to every word." She nodded and stepped into a space she had only dreamed about. The cockpit felt smaller than she imagined, but more alive, like standing inside the heartbeat of the entire aircraft. He pointed at a gauge flickering between two numbers. "Tell me every time that needle drops below the line. Loud enough for me to hear." She leaned forward, watching the gauge carefully. "I can do that. And if the captain shifts or stops breathing, you tell me immediately." "I understand." The plane shook again, firmer this time. The pilot tightened his grip, jaw clenched. "Is this normal?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, honesty in his voice. "But we're not falling. I promise you that. I just need to keep fighting the climb until we level out." She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. She simply said, "Tell me what else you need." And for the first time, the young pilot looked at her, not as a passenger, not as someone breaking rules, but as someone standing strong beside him, someone he could rely on. The alarm beeped again. The needle dropped, and her voice came through, steady and clear. "It's below the line." Asterisk. The needle dropped again. This time a little faster, a little lower. She called it out immediately, her voice steady even though her hands were beginning to sweat. The young pilot nodded sharply, adjusting the controls with a firm but careful motion. The cockpit lights reflected in his eyes, turning every blink into a silent calculation. Outside the window, the sky was bright and calm, completely unaware of the struggle happening inside the aircraft. She glanced at the horizon, then back. At the pilot. His breathing was uneven, but his focus never broke. He was holding everything together with 2 hands that were doing the work of 4. Altitude stabilizing. Slowly, he muttered, though it sounded more like he was reassuring himself than anyone else. She watched him, noticing every tiny movement, how he shifted his grip, how he pressed switches with quick but precise motions, how he leaned forward every time the plane responded a little too slowly. He wasn't panicking, but the weight on him was obvious. The captain still sat limp beside him, his chest rising and falling but his eyes shut. One of the medical volunteers tried calling his name again, checking his pulse, adjusting his mask. Nothing changed. Any improvement? The pilot asked without turning around. No, the volunteer said quietly. But he's stable. He just isn't waking up yet. The pilot exhaled sharply, not frustration at the volunteer, but frustration at the situation. I need him awake, he whispered. This isn't a one-person phase. She didn't know everything about flying, but she understood enough. Takeoff and landing required teamwork. This was a critical moment, and he was alone, except for her. What do you need me to do next? She asked, her voice calm, grounding him. He hesitated for a second, maybe debating whether to trust her more. But then he nodded. Stand behind me and look at that panel, he said, pointing. If any of the numbers start flashing red, tell me immediately. She leaned closer, memorizing the layout of the lights within seconds. They weren't as confusing as they looked. Patterns mattered more than labels. Machines always had a rhythm. She just needed to learn this one fast. The plane vibrated again, a deeper tremor this time. The young pilot straightened, his hand tightening on the control column. What was that? She asked, wind shear. Or the autopilot is refusing something. He said, I'm keeping it manual for now. She didn't like the sound of autopilot refusing anything. She kept her eyes on the panel, ready to call out the slightest flicker of danger. Passengers in the cabin were no longer whispering. They were openly anxious now. A few stood despite instructions, trying to peek toward the cockpit. The flight attendants kept telling them to sit, but the tension was spreading. This plane was filled with people who suddenly realized something serious was happening, and she was one of the only ones who could help stop it from getting worse. She looked at the pilot again. His shoulders were stiff, his left hand trembling slightly from strain. Hours of training had prepared him for emergencies, but not for being completely alone with an unconscious captain during takeoff. You're doing well, she said softly, surprising even herself. You're keeping the plane steady. He let out a breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. I don't feel steady, he admitted. But thank you. Another flicker appeared on one of the indicators. She pointed instantly. They're yellow flashing. I see it, he said, flipping a switch and adjusting the throttle. Good catch. She stepped a little closer, now standing almost beside him. The cockpit felt tight, but not uncomfortable. More like a space where every breath mattered, where teamwork was built in seconds rather than years. You're handling this better than most people would, he said suddenly. Eyes still on the instruments. So are you, she replied. This time, he did let out a breath that sounded almost like a small smile. I'm trying. A moment passed short, silent, but meaningful. They weren't strangers anymore, not in this narrow space. Not in this moment where every second felt like a test. Suddenly, the plane dipped more sharply than before, just enough for her stomach to drop. She grabbed the back of the seat to balance herself. Is that normal? She asked, voice calm but tight. No, he said, pulling the controls with more force. But I'm correcting it. The cabin behind them reacted instantly. Shouts, gasps, someone praying loudly. The sound hit the cockpit like a wave. We need to level out, he muttered. What can I do? She asked again, more firmly this time. He pointed to the trim wheel on the side. Hold it steady. Don't move it unless I tell you. Just keep it from sliding." She placed her hands on the wheel, gripping it firmly. The wheel vibrated beneath, her palms alive with the motion of the plane. It wasn't heavy, but it resisted her slightly, like something testing her strength. The pilot adjusted the controls again. Slowly, the plane steadied. "You're helping more than you know," he said. That she didn't answer. She just held the wheel, feeling the rhythm of the aircraft, feeling how her small action was making a real difference. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a passenger. She was part of the team trying to keep everyone safe. And as the cockpit lights reflected against her steady hands, she understood something deeply. She wasn't allowed in the cockpit, but right now, she belonged here. Her hand stayed firmly on the trim wheel, feeling every vibration, every small shift of the plane. The young pilot worked quickly beside her, adjusting controls with a focus so sharp it almost felt like the air around him was holding still. The cockpit was tense but strangely calm at the same time, like a storm waiting outside a window that hadn't broken yet. "We're leveling," he said quietly, more to confirm his own efforts than to inform her. "Just a little more." She nodded, eyes fixed on the trembling wheel beneath her palms. She didn't understand everything the plane was doing, but she could feel its behavior, like sensing when a machine was struggling and when it was easing back into balance. Behind them, the medical volunteers continued working on the captain, trying different techniques to wake him. Every few minutes, one of them gave a hopeful update. "His breathing is steady," or "His pulse is strong," but not once did they say, "He's opening his eyes." The young pilot glanced at the captain again, his jaw tightening. She could tell it wasn't fear that bothered him, it was responsibility. The kind that weighed on a person even when they were trained for it. The indicators flickered again. She spoke quickly. Yellow blinking. He made another adjustment. "Good. Keep calling them out exactly like that." The more he worked, the more she felt like she understood his thinking. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to buy time, buy stability, buy enough calm to make safe decisions. But time didn't wait long. A new alert beeped from the overhead panel, sharper, faster. She looked up, not sure what it meant, but the young pilot reacted instantly. He pressed a button, then another, breathing harder now. "We're getting close to turbulence," he said, his voice still low but edged with urgency. "Mild, I hope." She didn't like the pause after the word mild. The plane trembled, then shook harder. Cops rattled in the cabin. A few people screamed. A flight attendant called out instructions, trying to keep the passengers calm. But panic spread faster than reassurance. She tightened her grip on the trim wheel. The young pilot leaned forward, making quick adjustments. His forehead glistened with sweat. The small space filled with the hum of engines, the rattling of panels, the sharp beeps of warnings. "Is this dangerous?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said honestly. But not impossible. His honesty didn't scare her, it grounded her. She respected him more for it. The turbulence grew stronger. The cockpit shook. The lights flickered. She kept her feet planted, her body leaning forward slightly to stay balanced. Another warning beeped. "Tell me," he barked. She looked quickly. Top left corner. Flashing. He reached for a switch, but the plane jolted sideways before he could touch it. She stumbled, grabbing the side of the seat. He steadied the controls with both hands, arms shaking from the force. The passengers' voices grew louder, fear filling the cabin like rising water. She could almost feel the weight of everyone behind that door, their lives in this young pilot's hands. And hers. The turbulence eased suddenly, just enough to breathe again. The young pilot finally reached the switch he needed and corrected the issue, but his arms trembled afterward. He wasn't giving up, not even for a second, but he was running low on strength. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I will be," he said, his eyes fixed ahead. "We just need to get through another few minutes, and then..." Then I'll try to turn us back toward the airport." She exhaled, relief mixing with worry. "Is that safe?" "It's our best chance," he said. "But landing alone isn't simple. I'll need someone to help me watch everything." He didn't look directly at her when he said it, but she felt the meaning behind his words. Someone calm. Someone observant. Someone he trusted now. Another alert flickered. She called it out immediately. He adjusted again. The rhythm between them became almost natural. He flew. She monitored. He corrected. She called out changes. It felt like teamwork formed in the middle of chaos. But something unexpected happened. The captain shifted, just a small movement, his fingers twitching, his shoulder tilting slightly. She gasped. He moved. The young pilot's head whipped around, hope flashing across his face. "Captain, can you hear me?" The captain didn't respond. His eyes stayed closed. But his breathing deepened and his hand twitched again. "He's trying," one of the medical volunteers whispered. "His body is reacting." That small movement changed everything. If the captain woke up, even barely, he could assist with the landing. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be enough. But time was still pushing forward. The young pilot steadied the plane once more. "We're almost clear of the rough air," he said. "When we get through, I'll call the tower and request a priority landing." She nodded, keeping her eyes on the lights. The cabin behind them grew quieter, not calmer, but quieter. People sensed the turbulence easing. They sensed a shift, a thinning in the fear. "We can do this," she said softly. The young pilot glanced at her, a look of tired gratitude in his eyes. "We already are." Another flicker. She called it out. He corrected it instantly, and somewhere beside them, the captain's fingers twitched again, stronger. This time, something was changing. Something was waking. The captain's fingers twitched again, this time more clearly. The slight movement cut through the tension in the cockpit, like a thin beam of light breaking through clouds. She leaned forward immediately, her eyes widening with hope. "He moved again," she said, her voice steady but filled with something warm. The young pilot looked over quickly, his expression tightening with cautious optimism. "Captain, can you hear us? Please try to wake up." His voice softened in a way that revealed just how much he needed. The man beside him awake. But the captain didn't open his eyes. His breathing remained slow, steady, but deeper than before. His body was fighting its way back to consciousness. Just not fast enough. The young pilot turned back to the controls with a sigh that carried both hope and exhaustion. "If he wakes up even a little, it will help," he murmured. "But I can't wait too long. We need to start turning back." She nodded. The responsibility of that decision sat heavy in the air. Turning the aircraft wasn't just a small shift. It meant guiding hundreds of lives towards safety or danger, depending entirely on how well the pilot could handle it. "What do you need from me?" she asked again, the same question she had asked since she stepped into the cockpit. His answer came without hesitation. "Stay with me. Keep watching those indicators. Don't let anything slip." She placed her hands back on the trim wheel, feeling the soft vibration of the aircraft. It reminded her that the plane was alive in its own way, reacting, adjusting, resisting, cooperating. She could feel the rhythm of it now, as if she had been listening to it long enough to understand its language. The young pilot radioed the tower, requesting immediate return. "Captain is unconscious. I'm flying solo with assistance from a passenger. Situation stable, but not normal." Hearing him call her assistance made something shift inside her, not pride, but a grounded sense of belonging. For the first time in her life, she wasn't watching a flight from a distance. She was part of it. The tower responded with calm urgency. "Copy. You are cleared for direct approach. Emergency services will be ready on landing." He exhaled slowly and began the turn. She felt it right away, the subtle tilt, the soft pressure pushing her gently to one side. The movement wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. The plane was listening to him, trusting him. But that trust came with demands. As he turned the aircraft, the indicators began flickering again. She called them out sharply, one by one. Middle panel yellow. Left side blinking. Altitude needle dropping. He adjusted quickly, hands moving with precision, even though fatigue pulled at his muscles. She could see the strain in the way his shoulders tightened, the way his breaths came shorter and faster. "You're doing great," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but she saw the smallest shift in his jaw, a subtle moment of steadiness. Returning. Another tremor shook the plane. Not turbulence this time, just the aircraft responding to sharp adjustments. She held her stance, watching the panel, waiting for the next flicker. Behind them, the medical volunteers spoke again. "He's reacting more strongly now. Maybe he'll wake up soon." The young pilot didn't look back. "Keep talking to him. If he wakes up even halfway, let me know." The minutes passed slowly. The plane steadied, then shook, then steadied again. The sky outside turned softer as they left the rough air behind. A golden hue washed across the cockpit windows, warming the tight space and giving everything a strange feeling of quiet bravery. She looked at the young pilot. His face was tired but determined. His hands never stopped working. His mind never drifted. He was carrying the weight of the cockpit alone, yet he wasn't alone anymore. "We're almost aligned with the runway," he said, mostly to himself. "This next part will be the hardest." Landing. The words sat between them without being spoken. Everyone knew landing was the part that demanded precision, teamwork, timing. And he had only one conscious pilot on board himself. "What do I do during landing?" she asked, her voice calm even though her heart tightened. He finally turned to look at her. "Really look at her. You stay exactly where you are. You watch those indicators. And if something changes, you tell me faster than you ever have." "I will," she said without thinking twice. "You already saved us once," he murmured. "We just need to finish this." Just then, the captain's hand twitched again, this time more forcefully. One of the volunteers leaned closer. "Captain, can you hear me?" The captain's eyelids fluttered, barely, but enough for hope to spark again. "He's trying to wake up," she said, her heart lifting. The young pilot didn't turn around, not now. Not when he was guiding the plane toward a critical descent, but his voice softened. "If he wakes up in the next few minutes, it might change everything." Then he glanced at her again. "But if he doesn't, we land this together." She swallowed, not out of fear but out of understanding. She nodded firmly. "Then we will." He returned his focus to the controls, the runway still miles ahead but growing closer with every breath, every adjustment, every second of courage. The cabin behind them was silent, now completely silent, hundreds of lives holding their breath. The young pilot steadied the plane. She steadied her. Hands. The captain stirred again, and the runway waited. The moment was coming, the moment where everything mattered. Asterisk. The runway grew larger in the window, turning from a distant silver line into a clear path waiting to catch the plane. The young pilot's breathing slowed, not because he felt calm, but because he forced himself to be. His hands were steady on the controls, his eyes scanning every number, every light, every movement of the aircraft. "This is it," he said. Quietly. She nodded, tightening her grip on the trim wheel, feeling the soft shake of the aircraft as it began descending. The cabin behind them was silent, no whispers, no cries, no movement. Hundreds of people were holding themselves still, trusting two people they couldn't even see. She kept her eyes on the indicators. The lights flickered softly, steady for. Now the medical volunteer spoke from behind them. "Captain, please stay with us. If you can hear us, try to open your eyes." Then it happened. The captain groaned, soft, strained, but unmistakably alive. His eyelids flickered, opening just a sliver, enough to show consciousness. Enough to show he was still fighting. The young pilot didn't turn around. He couldn't, but his voice changed. "Is he awake?" "Barely," the volunteer said. "But he's trying." The captain's hand lifted weakly, touching the arm of his seat as if trying to pull himself upright. His head tilted slightly toward the controls, toward the familiar world he had spent his life mastering. "He wants to help," she whispered. The young pilot closed his eyes for a brief second, just long enough to gather strength. "Tell him we're landing. Tell him I need him to stay awake if he can." The volunteer relayed the message softly. The captain blinked again, fighting through the haze. His fingers brushed the edge of the instrument panel. He couldn't take control, not fully. But he was aware, present, a guiding presence more powerful than any switch or button. "We're with you," she said quietly to the young pilot. He nodded once, sharply. "Let's finish this." The plane dipped lower. The runway stretched ahead like a promise. "Flaps?" she called out instinctively. He adjusted them. "Set. Speed?" she asked. He checked. "Holding." Another indicator flickered yellow. She pointed instantly. "There. I see it." They worked together in perfect rhythm, now not trained, but connected by clarity and purpose. Every second mattered. Every word mattered. Every breath mattered. The wheels were still high above the ground, but the plane was aligning beautifully. The engines hummed with a steadier tone. The vibration softened. The aircraft responded like it trusted them. The young pilot's voice lowered. "Almost there. Almost." Passengers braced themselves. Seatbelts tightened. Eyes shut. Hands held tightly together. People prayed in whispers almost too soft to hear. The captain lifted his head again, just a bit. His eyes opened halfway. His gaze fell toward the main display, as if instinct guided him. His lips moved, forming two weak but clear words. "Too fast," she reacted instantly. "He says speed." The young pilot adjusted the throttle carefully, reducing just enough. The descent smoothed. She didn't know how the captain managed to notice that detail in his state, but he did. Even half-conscious, he was a pilot to his core. The runway rushed closer. The young pilot pulled slightly on the controls. "Hold. Hold." The wheels touched the ground with a soft but firm thump. Then another. Then the plane rolled. People screamed, not in fear, but in raw relief. He guided the plane down the runway, slowing steadily, gently, until the motion softened into a slow glide. Finally, he brought it to a complete stop. The engines quieted, the vibrations faded, and the cabin erupted into the loudest applause anyone had ever heard inside an aircraft. The young pilot leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for the first time since takeoff. His hands trembled. His chest lifted with a deep, exhausted breath. "It's over," he whispered. She let go of the trim wheel slowly, her hands shaking now that she no longer needed them to be steady. She stepped back, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest, heavy, warm, unbelievable. The captain moved again. This time, he managed to open his eyes fully. He looked at the young pilot, then at her, then at the controls. His voice was rough, but clear enough. "You, both of you, you saved everyone." The young pilot turned, his eyes shining with tired emotion. "I couldn't have done it alone. She helped me the whole way." The captain shifted his gaze toward her, a weak smile forming. "Thank you." She swallowed, emotions building unexpectedly. "I just did what was needed." The young pilot shook his head gently. "No, you did more than that. You stayed calm when none of this was your responsibility. You walked into the cockpit when most people wouldn't even stand up. Emergency crews waited outside the aircraft. Passengers were crying, hugging, whispering prayers of gratitude. People kept looking toward the cockpit, trying to glimpse the quiet passenger who had helped save them." She stepped back into the cabin for a moment, and passengers began applauding again, this time for her. A few called out thanks. One elderly woman touched her hand and whispered, "You were brave for all of us." She didn't know how to reply. She simply nodded, humbled. When she looked back at the cockpit, she saw the young pilot watching her. Not with admiration, not with surprise, not with respect. "You were meant to be here today," he said quietly when she returned. She smiled softly. "Funny, I wasn't even allowed in the cockpit." He smiled back, this time without exhaustion. "Rules didn't save the plane today. People did." She glanced at the controls, the captain resting, the young pilot breathing again, and the quiet hum of a plane that had been guided safely home. For the first time in her life, she understood something deeply. She hadn't just stepped into the cockpit. She had stepped into her own strength, and everyone on that plane would remember her for it.